Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a list of some books that I think are fantastic if you are hoping to try and get into specifically adult fantasy. So this is great for if you're not usually a fantasy reader, maybe you typically read young adult, but you're a little intimidated by adults. These are great ones, I think, for trying to jump into that age range and genre. Before jumping into the video, a big thank you to Book of the Month for working with me. And many of you know Book of the Month is an online book subscription service that has a variety of different genres and age ranges, and every single month they used to have 5 books to choose from. Now they have 5 to 7, so they have even more options. You get a brand new hardback every month, and if there's one month that you want to skip, you then can use that credit to get add-ons in other months. A lot of my anticipated releases end up being Book of the Month books, which is very convenient. And for this particular month, I'll go ahead and jump into what the books are. First up, we have the thriller Breathless. It's a chilling story of a mountaineering expedition gone very, very wrong. Make sure you have your oxygen pack ready. We also have the literary fiction Yerba Buena, brimming with warmth and humanity. This is a tale of 2 perfectly imperfect women yearning for something to call home. We have a gothic fiction called The Hacienda. What would you do if the house you just moved into turned out to be haunted? We're talking some properly gothic stuff. Next up, we have a historical fiction called Take My Hand, the moving story of a fiercely protective nurse who will stop at nothing to get justice for the girls in her charge. For the romance category, we have Part of Your World. This charming story of an unlikely small-town romance will have you swooning and firmly reassured love can conquer all. We also have a fantasy called Darling Girl. With dreams as nightmares, this gripping Peter Pan rewrite reveals a complicated story of fate and fortune. And for an add-on, you can get Holly Black's new story, Book of Night. A big thank you again to Book of the Month for working with me. If you're interested in checking them out, I'll have some information and a code in the description bar down below. I have done a video like this in the past, and I still stand by basically every book that I mentioned in that video, but I don't want to overlap and say any of those books again. However, I will have that video linked if you would like to see even more, and I'm just going to list off really quick the books that I talked about in that video so that if any of those you've heard of and you want more information, you know that you can jump into either that other video or other maybe in-depth reviews or things like that I've done. So the books mentioned in that video, we have Foundryside, Warbreaker, Trader's Blade, Jade City, Red Rising, which is technically science fiction, Rage of Dragons, Sword of Kaigen, and Queen of Blood. Like I said, I still think those are all absolutely fantastic, but I don't want to repeat myself. I'd like to give kind of an updated list and give you more options. And I'm actually going to be going about this a little bit differently. I wanted to try and find books that are great for if you enjoy other genres. So the genres that I'm going to be correlating with a specific beginner adult fantasy book would be romance, historical fiction, anime and manga, retellings and fairy tales, thrillers and comic books, and then mythology / literary fiction. I'll have timestamps down below if you're looking to jump to specific fantasy books for certain genres, but all that to say, finally jumping into it, I'm going to start with the romance one. So for those of you that enjoy romance, and maybe you like fantasy, but you're just not really finding any that are overlapping, I think a good one to try would be The Bridge Kingdom. The first 2 books in this series are essentially their own story, so there is a good resolution to the plot at the end of this, and then there's going to be more books in the series that take place within the same world, but just follow different characters. So you can jump into this one and just read the first 2 books, and it's not a huge commitment. They're pretty short, the chapters are short, so you can fly through it. And it's a very character-driven story, as you would expect from something that is more romance-centered, and it's enemies to lovers. So if you're somebody who loves that trope, I find that that trope can be a challenge because sometimes it becomes unbelievable. And while there is, of course, that tension that's built in automatically usually with enemies to lovers, sometimes when they're enemies, they say some pretty unforgivable things or do some pretty horrendous acts that you're like, I mean, how could you ever love them? And so it can be a little bit of a difficult trope. However, this one I think does that trope fantastically. The setup for the story is we follow 2 main perspectives, which are the love interests in the story. We have Lara and Aaron, and Lara is somebody who from the time that she was a little girl has been trained alongside her sisters to fulfill a marriage alliance. As far as which sister is going to fulfill this marriage alliance, you find out the details about that at the beginning of the story, and Lara ends up being the person who has to fulfill it. and she has been trained to fight. She's been trained to be a spy. Her goal is to try and gain information about this kingdom that she's being married into, report back to her father so that he can finally use that knowledge to conquer them, because they're essentially unconquerable. Lara believes that this particular kingdom is responsible for the hardships of her people, and so when she first arrives, she thinks Arn is a terrible person, and she thinks that he is an awful king who just doesn't care about anybody outside of his own country. But then as she is starting to discover more about him and the Bridge Kingdom, she's seeing there's a lot more to it than she ever expected. And then he is fully anticipating that she is going to be trying to gain information. And so that is why they are enemies initially. But as they come to get to know one another, they start trying to work together. And I was really surprised because as somebody who loves fantasy, if I'm going to read a fantasy romance, I still want the fantasy, right? I still want all the great scheming or whatever fantasy thing is really significant to the plot. I still want all those things plus great character relationship building. And I feel like this one delivered in that. The politics in this are really great, and the way that the author has thought through how one kingdom relates to another, how being an ally with this one affects an alliance with this kingdom, and then if you do something with this group over here, well, now they used to be allies, but they don't like you partnering with them, so now they're your enemy. She thinks through all of that. She thinks through the literal navigating of this country because it's made up of different islands, and that's in part why it's so difficult to conquer. In general, I just thought the politics, the economy, all of those things were fantastic. They weren't overwhelming. They didn't necessarily take over, but it definitely contributed to these characters having to work together. For those of you who really enjoy historical fiction, I have two recommendations. One would be She Who Became the Sun, and then the other would be Lancelot. The story is following a certain time period in history. It's following a certain figure in history, but with a little bit of a twist. And so we have this main character who believes that destiny should be hers. She specifically believes that the destiny that was meant for her brother should be hers. And so now she is trying to live out her life as him in every way possible. And then you have another character that parallels her, and this person is trying to gain revenge on behalf of their ancestors, and how their destiny and the other character's destiny, how they end up intertwining, I think is absolutely fascinating to follow. On the inside cover, it says, "To possess the mandate of heaven, the monk Zhu will do anything." And I think that absolutely perfectly captures this story, because these characters are ruthless, and it just goes to show what people have to do in order to attain this level of power. Lancelot is a beautifully written story that, as you would expect, follows Lancelot from the King Arthur legend. And this book just transports you to a different time. The way that the author writes their life, it's not a fast story. It's not a huge page turner. It's just something that sucks you in. It is such a gorgeous writing style, and I can't really pinpoint why. It's just the way that he brings everything to life I just think is fantastic. And so Lancelot, you follow him from the time that he's very young, and he has a quite tragic life, and you're just seeing him go from a boy to a man. And if you're somebody who enjoys Bloodsong, I always feel the need to say, check out Lancelot, because they're both great. But either way, I just found this story, man, there's passages that I just had to read and sit with because they're so moving. And I think that this author captures, this is going to sound silly, but just human interactions really well. And he captures different kinds of relationships really well. So where a lot of books, maybe it's all about somebody's love interest, or it's all about somebody's bond with their sibling, things like that. Because you're following this character from the time they're young, you explore all sorts of different kinds of relationships. You see friends, you see people they fall in love with, you see people that they see as mentors, as parental figures. You see all these different relationships, and it's just a beautiful, tragic story, and I highly recommend it if you're somebody who enjoys historical fiction, because it doesn't really feel like fantasy. It feels like you're reading... It honestly feels like you're watching a movie because of just the way that he's able to bring everything to life. If you're somebody who typically reads a lot of manga, or you enjoy watching anime, or both, then I would highly recommend reading Never Die. So this is technically a standalone book that I believe takes place in a world that has other books written in it as well. So if you end up liking the book, there are other ones that you can check out. But this one in particular follows right at the beginning. You see a character die, and then they are brought back to life. And the person who brought them back to life has this ability to do this, and they now are bound to this child. It's actually a little boy who's doing this. And now this boy, he has a mission, and he needs to recruit the best fighters in the world to serve him. And so you find characters that either are dead that he brings back to life, or you find characters that are still alive, but they might need to be taken out. The book does action scenes really well. I'm actually somebody who's quite picky with action scenes, and in this one, it felt like I was watching an anime, or it felt like I was playing a video game. I felt like I was playing Tekken while I was reading this book, and even the way that it titles the chapters whenever you have one character that's going to face off against another character is very much the, you know, like Eddie Gordo versus Jin Kazama. It just feels like, oh, here we go, we're getting ready, and they have different fight styles. If you are someone who enjoys thrillers and or comic books, I highly recommend checking out Vicious and its sequel Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. If you really like following characters that are not exactly good people, this is a great one to pick up. So the setup is it's our own world, and it is not widely known, but there is this conspiracy theory, we'll call it, that some people who die but immediately come back to life, there is a belief that when that happens, some people gain powers, kind of X-Men type of powers where everybody's powers are a little bit different. And most people are like, oh, that's not a thing. They're called EOs. And most people are like, that's not a thing. That's just whatever, some weird belief that people have. But we follow these two men who decide they're going to try and research this. And in doing this research, they're also thinking, well, maybe we should try to do it ourselves and see if we can gain any powers. Because that would be the ultimate way to discover it for ourselves. And so you get a split timeline, or a better way to put it, I think, would be a fractured timeline, because it's not like you have the past and present. You have the past when they were in college, an hour before. You have present day. You have 3 days before. And then it's all kind of pieced together as you go, which I think makes for a very interesting reading experience. But in present day, these two young men hate each other, and you see in the past that they got along and that they were basically best friends, and you're like, what happened? And you also see the effects of their experimentation, and they are not exactly good people. If you're somebody who enjoys retellings and fairy tales, I would check out Daughter of the Moon Goddess. So this one, I actually thought this was young adult when I was first seeing it talked about leading up to its release, and then when it was released, it's adult. But I do think it still is a book that if you are somebody who typically reads young adult, you could very easily read this. A big theme in it is kind of a coming of age, discovering yourself sort of story. And so I think that's something a lot of people can relate to. And if you're older, you can still sort of tap into that feeling. And just still the sense of discovering yourself, I think, is something that goes beyond a specific age. I think people are constantly having to reshape, and they change based off of what has happened in their life. And so you see that happen here. We follow a character who is the daughter of the moon goddess. This goddess was forced into isolation, and her daughter, nobody actually knew that she has this daughter. And so it's very important that her daughter's identity is kept a secret, and there is a threat brought upon them, and the main character decides that she is going to keep her identity a secret, but she's going to try to do what she can to save her mother from this isolation. And she's living now among these celestial beings, so they're kind of immortal. And you see the way in which time is captured in the story. Sometimes a lot of time will pass, but you as the reader will be reading and you're like, oh, I guess a year passed already. And so I think the author captures the feeling of immortality very well in this story, which is something I find in a lot of fairy tales, like fae stories. They don't age the same way. It says here too on the front, a retelling inspired by the Mid-Autumn Legend. And at the time that I'm filming this book, its sequel, I believe, is set to be released this year, and it is a duology, so if you enjoy this first one, you can then check out that second one as well. Last for today, we have mythology and literary type of stories. So there are so many fantasy books now coming out that are retellings of mythology, and specifically often characters in mythology that previously the focus was not on. And so there are so many books that I could mention for this one, and if I do another video like this in the future, or if I do a whole video focused on mythology, then there are so many more I could talk about. But for today, and the last one is going to be The Witch's Heart. So this follows Angrboda, who was one of the wives to Loki. Angrboda is not one of the gods, however, she does have her own kind of magic that the gods are very interested in. And so she tries to keep herself secluded and hidden from the rest of the gods, but she does bond with Loki. There's this relationship between them, and just following her life, it's actually incredibly tragic, but there are so many moments that are so beautiful. And if you're the kind of person, when you're reading a mythology, or a retelling of a mythology, I should say, if you like seeing the more human side to gods and goddesses, then I think this is a really good one, because sometimes in these stories, it's hard to connect because they behave so differently. So with this, you actually see this human side of them coupled with, because they live for so long, the way that they are different from humans, the way they're set apart. And that does create some challenges between Angrboda and Loki. But in general, this character, her love for her children, her confidence in herself, her ability to be content with the things that she has, and how that's disrupted because of just this one particular aspect of her life, it's just, I think, absolutely beautiful. It's one that I didn't think that I was going to be so gripped by, but I really, really enjoyed this story. That's it for some adult fantasy for beginners. Feel free to leave your own recommendations. Like I said, I will have my other video linked, as well as any more in-depth videos in the description bar down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.